Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. I'm with Mike Carroll, and we're going to talk about everything that you need to become HITRUST certified. So HITRUST is a more complicated framework in that there are a lot of moving parts to achieve certification. Mike Carroll is an expert, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a really good sense of how to obtain a HITRUST certification. In way of quick introductions, my name is Christian Hyde. I'm a managing director at Risk 360. I'm HITRUST certified as a practitioner, and with me we have Mike Carroll, who helps lead our HITRUST practice. Mike, you mind doing a quick intro?
Yep. Hey everyone, my name's Mike Carroll, manager at Risk 360. I've been with the firm about half a year now and have about 4 years of experience with HITRUST.
Awesome. So I think in way of where we're going today, our goal is really to give a background of HITRUST, how to get certified, talk about the framework a little bit, and then really just provide a lot of tips based on common questions that come up for clients who are considering certification or that we're taking them through the implementation certification process. Um, let's talk about background, Mike, if you don't mind. Like, where did HITRUST come from? How did this thing get market share? That whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. First thing is that HITRUST is governed by the HITRUST Alliance. They're responsible for creating and maintaining the CSF, which can be thought of really as the framework behind HITRUST. They maintain MyCSF. For all intents and purposes, that's the GRC tool that you'll be using to record all of your evidence, all of your testing, and submitting your report to HITRUST.
Hmm.
And they're also responsible for performing QA of the assessments completed by the external assessors and training those external assessors.
Yep. So one of the unique things about HITRUST is if you're going through a certification journey, you're probably already familiar with like SOC 2 or ISO 27001, but HITRUST is really a three-way relationship, more than the others. And that there's the assessor firm, so someone like Risk 360. There's the HITRUST Alliance, who's the governing body, and then there's the firm trying to get certification. And with most other certifications, it's more of a two-way relationship between, say, Risk 360 and the firm being audited. But in HITRUST case, we as the assessor actually have to submit stuff to HITRUST for QA, and we have to use their platform. So that's a bit of a nuance and something that I think adds a bit of complexity to it for individuals trying to get certified for the first time. And you mentioned the CSF, my CSF platform, Mike. Could you talk a little bit about what that is and how it's used?
Yeah, absolutely. So the MyCSF platform is a tool that all subscribers, which are essentially any clients pursuing certification, are required to subscribe to. There's a couple of different options you have. You can do the report only or have an ongoing subscription. But for the sake of the assessment, what we do is we record all of our testing within MyCSF. We link all of the documents that we test along with some other documentation, and that all gets uploaded to HITRUST, and that's where they complete their QA of our assessment and
Yep.
determine if a given entity is eligible for certification.
Yep. So great. So if you're thinking about certification, just be aware that there's a three-way match here. You're going to have to engage directly with HITRUST to purchase the platform. You're going to engage with the audit firm like us to do the certification. And if you engage a firm like Risk 360, you don't have to worry about that. We'll guide you through it. We'll help you set up that relationship with HITRUST, set up MyCSF, and do the whole thing. But that's kind of a unique experience for a lot of clients. The other thing I thought it might be helpful to cover right quick is just HITRUST has gone through a bit of a pivot. They used to be primarily healthcare organization focused, and I think that's still true. The biggest piece of the market is healthcare companies, but they're also moving to other industries and becoming industry agnostic. But if you're a healthcare company, especially doing business with any of the large healthcare providers, HITRUST is likely going to come up because they have a strong foothold there. So if you're wondering why you're being asked about this as opposed to SOC 2 or ISO or some other framework, it's probably because you're in the healthcare sector and there's just a lot of traction for this particular framework. So speaking of frameworks, there's a whole alphabet soup of frameworks out there. I've already mentioned a couple. There's SOC 2, there's ISO, there's HITRUST, there's NIST, there's a bunch of them. But HITRUST has some nuances, and it is a proprietary framework based on ISO and NIST that HITRUST maintains. So, Mike, can you talk a little bit about the framework itself, about scoping and that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the framework itself, like you had mentioned, Christian, is based primarily off of ISO 27001 and NIST 853. A lot of the requirements that you'll see really stem from that ISO 27001 standard. And what they primarily brought over from NIST 853 is just the implementation levels. Essentially, what that means is as we go through scoping, what HITRUST will do is they will record requirements that are applicable to your business based on the scoping questions, and riskier businesses are going to have more stringent requirements. So, for example, if there's a requirement around passwords, a lower risk entity might just have to record what like their password lengths are and the complexity requirements, whereas a more risky organization might have to go beyond just that basic requirement and implement MFA, for example.
Yeah, and this is a very important point. So if you're considering certification on high trust, one of the first questions that comes up besides costs is what is my audit burden here? How many controls and how many requirements are going to impact me as an organization? And obviously cost and number of controls are linked. But high trust is unique and there is not a set number of controls. It is actually driven based on your scope. So if you're an organization trying to get a quote and trying to become certified, you need to go through a scoping exercise with an assessor firm. So what we do at Risk 360 is anytime someone comes in and they want to understand their costs and their efforts associated with high trust, we actually log into the high trust platform and perform that scoping exercise because the MyCSF platform is going to output the controls that will be applicable to your organization. And that could be anywhere from like 200 controls to 1,000 controls, like literally that kind of delta. And then each of those controls could have subcomponents to it. So we want to be very specific about how we scope an organization so we have an accurate control count and try to get that to a manageable level. And the scope is based on the industry that you're in, the number of records you have, the number of locations, the number of employees, and another dozen or so attributes. And you need to do that in MyCSF so you have a good sense for what your scope is. So that's a huge piece if you're trying to get price and effort estimates. And you mentioned, Mike, that high trust is based on ISO and NIST loosely, but there's 19 domains. So could you maybe just give us a quick overview of what are those domains and maybe where can I find more information about them?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can actually find the domains themselves and the associated requirements within the CSF document. That's a publicly available document. You can request it right through HITRUST's website.
Mhm.
Those domains cover a majority of the different areas that are covered by the primary frameworks like PCI, SOC 2, and ISO. Everything from your information protection program, which is very similar to an ISMS, to access control, audit logging and monitoring, network protection, transmission protection, basically all the different areas that you need to make sure that you're secure within to secure the data that's in question within the scope of your environment.
Yep. We won't cover all 19 of those here because those get into a lot of detail. But I will point any listeners to another couple of resources. So one, you can go to HITRUST's website and download like an Excel version of these requirements and get a sense for the type of requirements to expect. We also have a white paper that we have written where we take those 19 domains and we kind of break them down into human readable format so that you, considering certification, can see what kind of requirements that you're up against. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, the real thing you need to do is go through the scoping exercise in MyCSF so you can actually see which controls are relevant to you. But there's 19 of those domains.
Yep. And the thing to
Um,
keep in mind here is that when you're diving into the domains, you need to receive a score of at least 3 in each domain to be eligible for certification. We'll go into the scoring a little bit later on, but really the main point here is that you can't just be strong in, let's say, endpoint protection, but be very weak in access control and receive certification. So you do have to be fairly mature across all of those 19 domains.
awesome. Thanks, Mike. So I want to cover the certification process. And that is, I think, more complex with high trust and more nuanced with high trust than probably most other frameworks. Again, because there is a three-way relationship here. So, Mike, at a high level, can you give us the steps if I'm an organization starting from really nothing and need to go all the way through the certification process? What does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's really four primary steps that we take as part of our approach within Risk 360. We do readiness, remediation, the validated assessment, and then submit for certification. As part of the readiness assessment, the first step we already mentioned is really that scoping. It's very critical because, again, the output of that will be the requirements that you have to comply with as part of this high trust assessment. Also, as part of readiness, we'll kind of take a snapshot of your system, current state, and see where you line up against the applicable requirements and what your domain scores are. This really sets the foundation for remediation. So based on your gap assessment, we determine where it's most appropriate to prioritize in terms of remediating any deficiencies to raise those scores again to a 3 for each domain so that you'll be eligible for certification.
I want to talk a little bit more about that right quick, Mike, because this is to me one of the most critical steps. Because for most other certifications, it's more black white. It's a yes no thing, where you go through the gap assessment against a framework, and if you're not doing it, you need to do it. But with high trust, there's two variables. One, there's the customized control set, so we need to get what that is first through the scoping exercise. And the second thing is what you alluded to here is that high trust, every control is based on a score. So you can have a score from 1 to 5. And you have to have at least a 3, I think it is, Mike, on each one
Yep.
to be able to get certified. But you might not want a 5 because if you go for a 5 on every control, it's going to create a lot of work for you. So in some situations, it might make more sense for your organization to meet the minimum standard, especially that first year, so you don't take on so much audit burden that the cost is far exceeds the risk that you're reducing. So, Mike, before we move on, can you talk a little bit about as we're going through readiness and we're doing gap assessments, how do scores come into play there?
Yeah, great question. So there's 5 components of each requirement that you're going to be measured up against. The first one is policy, second one's process, third is implemented, fourth is
Yep.
measured, and fifth is managed. Each of those comprises a portion of your overall score for those requirements. For measured and managed, those are typically a lot harder to reach because you have to prove that not only do you have a control implemented, but that you're actively managing it, you've got metrics around it, you're tracking it. Those are a lot harder to evidence. And when you compare them to the policy, process, and implemented scores, they're actually lower scores. So what we recommend at Risk 360 is spending the bulk of your time on A, the policies and procedures. Make sure you have a documented process for making sure that you're in compliance with each requirement. And then B, implementing controls. And we do recommend kind of a risk-based approach here. We don't want to implement controls just for the sake of a standard or requirement. We want to make sure that it makes sense with your business.
Yep. Yeah, and that's when we get through that readiness assessment, and I kind of think of it as your punch list. So hopefully we've done the strategy of identifying where your gaps are, identifying the appropriate implementation levels, and then giving you that punch list of what you need to do as an organization to get certified. And that's where remediation comes in. So, Mike, can you kind of pick it up at remediation and take us through?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, at the end of the readiness assessment, kind of the output of that is we'll give you a document that outlines each of your scores, current state against the domain scores. Again, it has to be a score of at least 3 to be eligible for certification. But we go a level lower too, and we give you scores for each requirement. That way you could focus on the lowest scoring domains and the lowest scoring requirements within those domains. We do have some policy and procedure templates that you can help leverage to make sure that you're able to meet the policy and process requirements. In addition to that, we also can help with implementation, at least to some degree, depending on the nature of a control. Again, if there's something where you have to implement like a SIM tool or an entire technology, it's probably not worth the effort, but we can help with some of those easier to reach requirements that need to be implemented.
Yep. So once an organization's done with remediation, and we'll talk about timelines here in a second, then we go through the validated assessment process. So what does the validated assessment process look like, Mike?
So as part of the validated assessment, we're actually going to collect documentation to validate your scores. And HITRUST actually has this rubric that all external assessors have. And we use that rubric, take a look at the evidence that you provide, and we'll score your evidence based off of that for each requirement. So as part of the validated assessment, we'll do a lot of walkthroughs. We'll collect some documentation, policies, procedures, configuration settings, other system screenshots, and then we'll score your assessment. Again, as part of remediation, the goal there is to make sure that you've got a score of at least 3 for each domain. So in theory, by the time we reach that validated assessment, you should have a pretty high comfort level that you're going to meet the requirements for certification.
Yep. So we get through validated assessment with the client, and then another high trust nuance here is that we have to actually submit that whole body of work to high trust themselves for certification. So, Mike, I know you've been through that many times. What does that submission process look like?
Yep. So there's a couple different documents that you submit to HITRUST. A couple of them on our end. A few are like the scoping documents that the clients will maintain or the subscribers. But again, once we have all the documentation within the MyCSF tool and linked to the applicable requirements, what we'll do is send the assessment over to HITRUST and they'll perform their QA. As part of their QA, they're going to review 100% of the requirements that we labeled as not applicable, just to make sure that the justification is good. After that, they're going to take one requirement from each domain, and they're essentially going to re-perform our testing to make sure that it was performed to meet the standards that they have of their external assessor firms. As
Yep.
long as they're okay with that, then they will actually move forward with the certification process.
Yep. And just for context, if you're pursuing certification, most of your effort as a firm achieving certification is those first three stages: the readiness, the remediation, and validated assessment. The submission for certification is largely a burden on firms like Risk 360, where we're quarterbacking the QA with HITRUST. They're scrutinizing our work, we're interfacing with them, and our job is to get through that QA and really to keep the client who's trying to get certification informed of that process.
Yep, absolutely. So we're primarily the liaison at that process. So HITRUST might come back as part of their QA and have questions or require additional context, and we really fill in the gaps there.
Awesome. So the next question is, there's four steps. What is the timeline to achieve certification? So if you're thinking about getting certified and you want to report up to, either clients or stakeholders and give them some estimate for how long this is going to take, we'll talk through that. And then there's a couple nuances here on timeline, because HITRUST specifies the duration of certain steps, and we're going to talk through each of those. And also, how long does QA take on HITRUST in, which is highly variable. So again, Mike, can you kind of walk us through, of those four steps, how much time can we expect for each, and what are some of the nuances?
Yep, absolutely. So happy to draw out kind of a typical timeline. Again, this really varies primarily on the maturity level of the organization in question. But the first step, readiness, we can typically get that done in about a month. Again, a lot of these are walkthroughs. We might request some evidence, not to the same level as a validated assessment, but typically about a month to get kind of a current state assessment of where you are against the in-scope HITRUST requirements. After that, we'll go into remediation, and this can last anywhere from 3 months to 6 months typically. The thing to keep in mind with remediation is that all controls before the validated assessment have to be functional for a period of at least 90 days or 3 months. So
Yep.
after you remediate, it kind of starts that timeline, and then 90 days later, you're eligible to start that validated assessment testing.
Yep. That's an important nuance. So if you're budgeting, you're communicating up to a client or your board, when am I going to get HITRUST certified? One of the steps you need to take into account is, if your remediation takes 3 months, those controls have to sit in place for 3 months, 90 days. So that's an additional piece of your timeline that you have to account for as you're moving through the process. So thanks, Mike. They're remediated. The controls are in place for 90 days. Then we move into validated assessment. What's the timeline on that?
That really depends as well on primarily your ability to collect evidence, but generally around 2 to 3 months is what we're seeing. So again, as part of this process, we might have some interviews or some walkthroughs with control owners. We're going to request evidence. So depending on the turnaround time for that evidence, I would say around 2 to 3 months is kind of the baseline that we're seeing, or the most common timeline that we're seeing.
Is there a does HITRUST specify kind of a time period? Can I take as long as I want, or is there kind of a maximum time period a validated assessment can happen over?
So HITRUST actually does have another 90-day window for this. So all of your testing has to be completed within a 90-day window. That means from my first date of testing as an external assessor to the last date of testing, I've got a 90-day window to complete that.
Yeah, one thing I want to point out is, often clients are very anxious to get started on that validated assessment, so they'll kind of click go in MyCSF. But once you click go in that platform, you have 90 days to complete the assessment. So I've never experienced this, but I've heard of instances where organizations run over in time, just because they were a little bit premature on their start on that validated assessment.
Yep.
So our advice is, don't click go and start that validated assessment until you're really confident you're ready to move forward, because you only have 90 days, which should be plenty. And then once you get through the validated assessment, what is HITRUST communicating today in terms of the time it takes to get through the quality assurance review?
So the SLA right now is about 2 to 3 months. Again, this really varies just depending on the level of rigor that they put into the assessment, meaning that if they identify some issues from the sampled requirements that they look at, they might go back to the external assessor firm and have some questions that require follow-up and then drag the timeline. But 2 to 3 months is about your baseline SLA from when you submit the assessment to when you hear back from HITRUST as far as the results of their review.
Yeah, I know in the past, High Trust has communicated to us that they're very busy. So 2 months is kind of a minimum. That's 60 days, and sometimes it can go beyond that. So again, that's one of those things that are out of our control, out of the company who wants to get certified's control, and we're just waiting on High Trust. So if you're building a timeline, communicating that to your stakeholders, build in that time for remediation, build in the time for those controls to operate for 3 months, build in the time for the validated assessment, and don't forget to build in the time for high trust QA, which could be 60 to 90 days before you actually get a certification in hand.
Yep.
And then once I get a certification, Mike, can you talk about what does the certification look like, and where would I get it?
Yep, so you get 3 documents as a result of certification. The first one is going to be your letter of certification. This is really similar to what an AOC is within a PCI assessment. So if any firms, prospects, or customers want evidence that you've completed a high trust validated assessment, that's the letter that you would give them. The second is your actual high trust report. This is very similar to a ROC where it goes requirement by requirement and states your scores along with any other information, including scoping, any notes you had on the applicable controls or requirements, and so on and so forth. And the third one is actually a NIST CSF report, and a lot of people don't realize this, but like we mentioned before, high trust is built upon other frameworks. So as an output of going through a high trust validated assessment, you actually receive a NIST CSF report as well.
Yep. So if you're wondering what those physically look like, the compliance document's basically a one pager, and then the second one's a really long report that could be 100 pages, and then the NIST CSF report's pretty thorough too. So you basically get one summary and two really long reports that you can potentially provide to your stakeholders. Awesome, Mike. So we kind of have a sense for what the certification process is, what the timeline is, and now we put together a bunch of kind of rapid fire Q&A questions. So if you're in the certification process, here's the stuff that we're hearing from clients all the time, and let's see how good you are, Mike. We're just going to run through a bunch of these and have a chance to talk about them. So the first one is, this is directly related to effort and cost. And so that's how many requirements should I expect after I go through scoping and I have my number of controls and requirements? What's an average number of requirements that I can expect?
I'm going to give the safe answer and say it depends, like everyone else. But the biggest thing to keep in mind here is that it really depends on the amount of data that you're dealing with and sensitive records. So, what we're seeing, a lot of our clients are kind of in that high growth tech, the SaaS type companies, B2B businesses. They typically have about 300 to 350 requirements. So, I would say that's kind of the most common set of requirements that we see.
Yeah. And just for a point of comparison, so you can conceptualize the amount of effort we're talking here, is the typical SOC 2 report has about 50 controls. ISO 27001 has 114 controls, and then an ISMS that adds probably another 50. So you're talking about 175. So SOC 250, 175 or so for ISO 27001, and then you look at high trust, which we're seeing minimum of 300, average of about 350. Some are getting up in the 500, 600 range. So it can be quite a bit of an effort. So just prepare for that when you're kind of doing your business case for if you want to do high trust. And if you're in the healthcare industry, it's probably a have to have.
Yep, absolutely.
Second thing that comes up a lot, Mike, is the platform. So do you have to use high trust MyCSF platform, or is that an optional thing?
You do have to use the platform for a couple of reasons. The first one is the scoping. So you can't receive your customized set of requirements without going through the MyCSF platform. You can perform the gap assessment offline typically, but then at the end of the assessment, you do have to submit everything through MyCSF, and that's where they're going to upload your final reports. So for a validated assessment to go through the entire process, yes, you do have to license the platform.
And then just heads up from a budgeting perspective, a full subscription to that platform. So if you're getting certified, you're going to pay two parties. You're going to pay the firm like Risk360 to do the validated assessment, but you also have to pay HITRUST for a subscription to their platform. And I believe a year subscription is currently $14,000 a year. Is that right, Mike?
I believe it depends on the level of subscription.
Okay. So what is the range? Do you have a sense?
I don't have a sense just because a lot of clients just have to go directly through HITRUST for that. So we don't really get a lot of transparency into the sales process. So that would be a question that you would have to go to HITRUST with.
I think what I'm hearing though is like above 10 grand though for the full year subscription. Talk to
Yep,
HITRUST
that's
because
correct.
they're probably negotiate and there's probably a lot of factors, but it's in that range if you're preparing a budget.
Yep.
Um, Next thing that comes up that we get asked from by a lot of clients is, we get through readiness and they have a lot of gaps. There's a lot of policy gaps, a lot of writing. What kind of resources does Risk 360 have available to get through the remediation process?
Yep. So the primary resources that we have are some template policies and procedures. Again, there's really no one size fits all approach. So these will have to be customized to custom fit your organization. But we do have example policies and procedures that you can leverage as part of your remediation efforts.
Yep. Keep going through these, Mike. So the other thing is, I think because high trust is so ingrained in the healthcare space, there's this conception that high trust is the equivalent to being HIPAA compliant. So can you talk about what is the difference between being high trust certified and HIPAA compliant? And by getting high trust certified, are you automatically HIPAA compliant?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to dive into that. So, as I'm sure you're aware, there is no HIPAA certification, quote unquote. Essentially, what would happen is if there was a breach or an OCR investigation, they would go into your environment to determine if you were HIPAA compliant at that point. What HITRUST provides you with is really a framework to become HIPAA compliant. It's a risk-based approach because the requirements that you're answering are custom fit to your environment and your organization. And also there are regulatory factors that you can add, which are optional frameworks. And you could add on the HIPAA security rule, the privacy rule, and the breach notification rule. Additionally, I don't believe it's been released yet, but HITRUST has announced plans for a compliance reporting pack, where if you
Cool.
complete a validated certification, they actually map the requirements back to HIPAA so that you could demonstrate compliance.
Great. Another nuance to high trust that I'm not extremely familiar with, but I'd love you to kind of expand on it is I know that high trust updates their framework at least once per year. Sometimes there's major updates, sometimes there's minor updates. Um, can you talk about like what are the nature of those updates? How do they impact becoming certified? That kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So the updates are really to make sure that HITRUST is in alignment with current trends and relevant risks and threats. So what they'll do is at least annually they will update the framework. Like you had mentioned, there's minor and there's major updates, and those are kind of referenced by that front number. So they'll say like, this is CSF 10.1. 10 was the most recent major framework update, and the point 1, the point 2, the point 3, those are minor framework updates. What you have to do is you have to certify over the most recent major update. So if that's 10, which it currently, actually it's 9. So being that that's 9 right now, you could certify under anything from 9 to 9.4.2. Once 10 comes out, you'll have generally 6 months to flip over to 10 after your high trust certification expires.
Yeah, so I guess the bottom line there is if you're considering certification, that's probably a good conversation point to have with your assessor, is to just understand like what is the path, like what is the current major release, when to expect the next major release, because there could be situations where your implementation is timed as such where they're about to do a major release and you might want to consider the implications there if you're going through a kind of initial certification.
Yep, absolutely.
Um, I want to talk about costs, but before we get there, is why high trust? So there's a whole alphabet soup of different certification mechanisms out there, and I think the reason most organizations get high trust certified is ultimately because a customer is forcing them to go down that path, or
Mhm.
prospective customers are forcing them. But do you see other advantages over high trust to high trust over other frameworks?
I do. So if you're looking at this from a maturity level, I do think it's the most robust framework on the market. The first reason being that it's updated very frequently, especially in comparison to a lot of the other frameworks. So you're keeping up with current industry trends and making sure that your current environment is secure based on threats that we're seeing throughout the industry and throughout a variety of different environments. The second one is that it's actually based off of some industry leading frameworks, namely ISO and NIST. Those are very well respected, so you do kind of receive some of the goodness out of those frameworks when you pursue a high trust certification.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the big question I know that everyone wants to know is how much does a high trust certification cost?
Yeah, so again, this one really varies. So you got to take into consideration first that licensing agreement for the MyCSF platform. So that's definitely added into there. And then the second part is the external assessor that you're working with. Generally, the cost of the assessment is going to be consistent with the level of effort required, meaning the requirements. So depending on the amount of requirements that you have to comply with, that's a big driver of the cost of your assessment.
Yep. And just thinking, I like to help people try to budget for this. So if I'm a organization going through this for the first time, um, let's just say you're a SaaS kind of business to business company, not a major healthcare conglomerate, because those costs are going to be very different. But
Yep.
if you're a technology based business, I would say the things that you need to budget for are one, your MyCSF subscription. So that's going to be between 10 and 15 grand, and that's what you're paying High Trust directly. The second thing that you need to budget for is the validated assessment process. So what you would be paying a firm like Risk 360. Those fees will differ obviously based on the number of requirements in your scope, but I would say the range is typically between 40 and 100K. And that's going to depend on your firm's complexity, the number of records that you gather, etc. But that's probably a decent planning factor. If you believe you're less complex, go lower. If you know that you're very complex, go a little higher. And then the third piece of cost that often is unaccounted for is the cost for your team's resources and tools and technology that you're going to need to become certified. So really, you're probably going to need a full-time employee on this, especially your first year, to kind of project manage this and get through the certification cost. And that's probably the biggest cost. So whatever a full-time employee costs to your organization based on your market. And that combined is probably a good budgetary consideration for achieving a high trust certification. Obviously, with a ton of variables depending on your unique circumstances, but that's probably a good starting point.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. So thanks, Mike, for answering all of those questions. I do want to talk about some free resources that we want everyone to be aware of if you're considering your high trust journey. So the first resource that we have put together is our Learning Center. So you can go to risk360.com/learn and you can click on our High Trust Learning Center. And we have a lot of free resources in there, including videos, frequently asked questions, white papers that you can download, things like that. And I think if you're trying to educate, that's a great place to go. The next thing that you need to know about is our white papers. So you can go to risk360.com/white paper, click on High Trust, and we have a lot of detailed white papers that kind of break out the framework, the implementation process, in more grant fine level detail than we talked about today. And then the last thing that everyone needs to know about is check out our YouTube channel. You're probably watching that right now, but we have a whole playlist for High Trust. You can see a video where I talk to High Trust Chief Privacy Officer Nicole Davenport about what they're doing around privacy and privacy in general. We put out a lot of videos just like this, and our plan is to continue to create these kind of videos to talk about very specific topics that you might have questions around. But those are all free resources available to you that you can go and download and watch those videos and things like that. So great. If you like this kind of content, check us out on LinkedIn. Check us out on YouTube. You can also see most of this content if you like it in podcast format. And then we occasionally do live streams on Twitch as well. So, Mike, I appreciate your time today. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise.
Thanks a lot. Happy to be on.